In the summer of 1962, two worlds collided in ways that would fuel speculation for decades. On one side stood the most powerful political family in America. On the other, the most famous actress in the world. What connected them has never been fully proven. What happened because of that connection has never been fully explained. And the questions surrounding their relationship, brief or lasting, intimate or distant, have never been definitively answered. Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedy family. The names alone carry weight. Together they form one of the most enduring and controversial intersections of fame, power, and tragedy in American history. The allegations are serious. The evidence is fragmentary. The testimonies are conflicting. And the stakes, both then and now, remain extraordinarily high. This is not a story with clear villains or obvious heroes. It is a story built on rumor, innuendo, witness accounts that shift over time, and a few documented moments that have been interpreted in vastly different ways. It is a story where the absence of proof has been taken as proof of concealment, where silence has been read as guilt, and where the death of the central figure has left a gap that has been filled with theory, speculation, and, in some cases, deliberate misinformation. The relationship, if it existed, began in a world where access meant everything. Marilyn Monroe was not just an actress. She was a symbol, a presence that commanded attention wherever she appeared. She moved in circles that included studio executives, playwrights, athletes, and politicians. She had been married to a baseball legend and a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright. She was photographed with presidents. She sang for troops overseas. She was, by any measure, one of the most recognizable women on the planet. The Kennedy family, by 1961, had ascended to the pinnacle of American political power. John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th president in January of that year. His brother Robert Kennedy served as Attorney General. Another brother, Edward Kennedy, would soon enter the Senate. Their father, Joseph Kennedy, had spent decades building the family's wealth and influence. Their mother, Rose, maintained the family's public image with discipline and precision. The Kennedys were not just politicians, they were a dynasty. The first documented connection between Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedys occurred in the early 1950s. Marilyn had been introduced to Peter Lawford, a British-born actor who had married Patricia Kennedy, the president's sister, in 1954. Lawford became a bridge between Hollywood and the Kennedy family. He hosted gatherings at his beach house in Santa Monica. He arranged introductions. He facilitated access. Through Lawford, Marilyn entered the social orbit of the Kennedys. By most accounts, Marilyn met John F. Kennedy for the first time in the mid-1950s, years before he became president. The meeting was social. There is no evidence that it was anything more. But after Kennedy's election in 1960, the nature of their interactions, and the frequency of those interactions, became a subject of speculation. Marilyn was seen at events where Kennedy was present. She was photographed near him on a few occasions. She was, according to some witnesses, in contact with him by phone. The most public moment of their connection came on May 19, 1962. Madison Square Garden in New York hosted a massive fundraiser for the Democratic Party, celebrating President Kennedy's upcoming 45th birthday. Marilyn Monroe was invited to perform. She arrived late, as was often her habit. She wore a dress so form-fitting that it had to be sewn onto her body. She walked onto the stage and sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," in a voice that was breathy, playful, and unmistakably intimate. The performance lasted less than a minute. The audience erupted. Cameras flashed. Kennedy, seated in the presidential box, smiled and laughed. After Marilyn finished, he took the microphone and joked, "Thank you. I can now retire from politics after having had 'Happy Birthday' sung to me in such a sweet, wholesome way." The audience laughed. The moment was broadcast. Photographs were published in newspapers across the country. And in the months that followed, that performance became a focal point for those who believed that Marilyn and the president were romantically involved. But a performance is not proof. A photograph is not evidence. And a public appearance does not confirm a private relationship. What exists beyond that moment is far less clear. There are claims, there are testimonies. There are secondhand accounts from individuals who say they heard things, saw things, or were told things by people who are now dead. But there is
What
no
does
letter
exist
in
is a
Marilyn's
pattern of
handwriting
association.
confessing to an affair.
There
There
is
is
no
friendly with
recording
Peter
of a phone
Lawford,
call
who is
that
married to the
definitively
president's
establishes
sister. Intimacy.
There is
Lawford
no
posted
diary
parties
entry
that
that
the
names the
president
president
attended when
as
he
a
was in
lover.
California. Marilyn was invited to some of those parties. She was seen at Lawford's beach house on multiple occasions. Some guests at those gatherings later claimed that Marilyn and the president spent time alone together. Others said they saw nothing unusual. The accounts depend entirely on who is asked and when they are asked. One of the most frequently cited sources for the alleged affair is a Secret Service agent who worked on Kennedy's detail. In interviews conducted years after Kennedy's death, the agent claimed that Marilyn had visited the president at his hotel during trips to California. The agent said that security protocols were adjusted to allow her entry without being logged. He said that other agents were aware of the visits but were instructed not to discuss them. The agent's account has been repeated in books and documentaries, but it has also been disputed. Other Secret Service agents who worked the same detail said they saw no evidence of such visits. Hotel logs from the relevant dates do not show Marilyn's name. No photographs exist of her entering or leaving the locations in question. Testimony from individuals who were close to Marilyn during this period is similarly divided. Some friends and colleagues said she spoke about the president with affection. Others said she never mentioned him in a romantic context. Her acting coach, Paula Strasberg, reportedly told her husband that Marilyn had confided in her about a relationship with someone powerful, but Strasberg did not name the person. After Strasberg's death, her husband repeated the story, adding details that could not be verified. Whether those details were accurate or embellished over time is impossible to determine. There is also the matter of timing. The Madison Square Garden performance took place in May 1962. Marilyn died in August 1962. If there was a romantic relationship between Marilyn and the president, it would have occurred during a narrow window of time. The president's schedule during those months is documented. He was in Washington for most of that period. He traveled occasionally to his family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and to his residence in Palm Beach, Florida. He made a few trips to California, but those trips were official and heavily covered by the press. If Marilyn had been with him during those trips, maintaining secrecy would have required the cooperation of numerous individuals, including Secret Service agents, staff members, hotel employees, and journalists. Secrecy on that scale is possible, but it is difficult. The more people involved, the greater the likelihood that someone will speak. And over the decades, some have spoken. But their accounts are often vague. They describe seeing Marilyn at a location where the president was also present. They describe hearing rumors. They describe being told by someone else that something happened. Very few claim to have witnessed an intimate moment directly. And those who do make such claims often lack corroborating evidence. The story becomes more complicated when Robert Kennedy enters the picture. Robert Kennedy, known as Bobby, was the president's younger brother and served as Attorney General during the Kennedy administration. He was deeply involved in his brother's political life. He was also a husband and a father of 7 children. By all public accounts, he was committed to his family. But in the years following Marilyn's death, claims began to surface that he too had been involved with her. These claims are even more contested than those involving the president. Some witnesses say that Robert Kennedy visited Marilyn's home in Los Angeles. Others say he was never there. Some say they saw him with her at social gatherings. Others say they never saw them together. Some say Marilyn spoke about Bobby with romantic interest. Others say she mentioned him only in passing, if at all. The evidence, once again, is testimonial and contradictory. One of the key figures in this part of the story is Peter Lawford. Lawford's position as the president's brother-in-law gave him access to both the Kennedy family and to Marilyn. He was present at many of the events where Marilyn and the Kennedys were said to have interacted. After Marilyn's death, Lawford became a source of both information and confusion. In some interviews, he suggested that Marilyn had been involved with the Kennedys. In others, he denied it. In still others, he hinted at things he could not say. His account shifted depending on when he was asked and what he was being asked about. Lawford's credibility was further complicated by his personal struggles. By the late 1960s, his marriage to Patricia Kennedy had ended. He battled substance abuse. He gave interviews to tabloid publications. He appeared in documentaries that were sensationalized. Some of the statements he made during this period were clearly exaggerated or false. But that does not mean everything he said was untrue. It simply means that separating fact from embellishment in his testimony is nearly impossible. Another source of claims about Marilyn's relationship with the Kennedys comes from private investigator Fred Otash. Otash worked in Los Angeles during the 1960s and was known for conducting surveillance on behalf of clients who wanted information on their spouses, business partners, or rivals. Otash claimed that he had been hired to place listening devices in Marilyn's home. He said that recordings were made of conversations between Marilyn and the Kennedy brothers. He said those recordings captured intimate and politically sensitive discussions. Otash described the contents of those recordings in interviews before his death in 1992. But he never produced the recordings themselves. He said they had been destroyed or taken by government agents. Without the tapes, his claims remain unverified. The idea that Marilyn's home was bugged has been repeated by other investigators and researchers. Some have suggested that the surveillance was conducted by organized crime figures seeking leverage over the Kennedy administration. Others have suggested it was done by political rivals or by intelligence agencies. The theory is plausible. Wiretapping was not uncommon during that era, but plausibility is not the same as proof. No recording has ever surfaced. No transcript has been authenticated. The claims rest entirely on the word of individuals who say they heard the tapes or were told about them by others. What is documented is that the FBI had an interest in Marilyn Monroe. The Bureau maintained a file on her, as it did on many prominent figures during the Cold War era. The file has been partially released through Freedom of Information Act requests. The release sections show that Marilyn was monitored because of her associations with individuals who were suspected of having communist sympathies. She had attended events organized by progressive groups. She had been married to playwright Arthur Miller, who had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The FBI's interest in Marilyn was primarily ideological, not personal, but the file also contains references to her social life. It notes her connections to powerful individuals. It mentions rumors about her relationships, and it includes redacted sections that have never been made public. What those sections contain is unknown. Requests to declassify them have been denied on national security grounds. Critics argue that there is no legitimate reason to keep information about a deceased actress classified more than 60 years after her death. Supporters of the redactions argue that the files may contain references to ongoing intelligence matters or to individuals who are still alive. The question of whether Marilyn had a romantic relationship with either John F. Kennedy or Robert Kennedy cannot be answered with certainty based on the available evidence. But the question of whether she knew them socially can be answered. She did. She met them through Peter Lawford. She attended events where they were present. She performed for the president at a major public fundraiser. These facts are not in dispute. What is in dispute is the nature and extent of those interactions. Were they friendly but professional? Were they flirtatious but not physical? Were they romantic and intimate? The answer depends on which testimony is believed and which is dismissed. And that decision is often influenced by assumptions about Marilyn, about the Kennedys, and about what seems plausible given the power dynamics and social norms of the early 1960s. Marilyn's own words on the subject are scarce. She did not write extensively about the Kennedys in any surviving letters or documents. She did not give interviews where she discussed them in detail. The few references that exist are secondhand. Friends and colleagues have reported that she spoke about meeting the president. Some say she seemed excited by the attention. Others say she seemed wary of becoming involved with someone so powerful and so public. None of these accounts can be verified. They are recollections of conversations that took place decades ago, filtered through memory and interpretation. One document that has been frequently cited in discussions of Marilyn's connection to the Kennedys is a letter reportedly written by her to someone she called a very important person. The letter, which surfaced years after her death, described feelings of loneliness and frustration. It mentioned feeling used. It did not name the person to whom it was addressed. Some have argued that the letter was written to John or Robert Kennedy. Others have argued that it was written to someone else entirely or that it was not written by Marilyn at all. Handwriting analysis has been inconclusive. The letter's provenance is unclear. Its authenticity remains a matter of debate. Theories about Marilyn's death often intersect with theories about her relationship with the Kennedys. Some have argued that her death was not a suicide but a homicide, carried out to silence her before she could reveal details of her affairs with the president and his brother. This theory gained traction in the years following her death, particularly after the assassinations of both John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. The idea that all three deaths were connected became a staple of conspiracy literature. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial and speculative. It relies on the assumption that Marilyn possessed information that was damaging enough to warrant her murder. It assumes that she was planning to go public with that information. It assumes that individuals with the means and motive to kill her were willing to do so. And it assumes that such a killing could be carried out and covered up without leaving definitive proof. Each of these assumptions can be questioned. Each requires believing a series of events that have not been conclusively demonstrated. Robert Kennedy's presence in Los Angeles on the day of Marilyn's death has been a focal point for those who believe he was involved. Official records place him in Northern California that day, attending a meeting of the American Bar Association in San Francisco. But some witnesses claim to have seen him in the Los Angeles area. A few said they saw him near Marilyn's home in Brentwood. These sightings have never been confirmed. No photographs exist. No official logs document his presence. The witnesses who made these claims have been questioned about their reliability. Some have stood by their accounts. Others have recanted or admitted uncertainty. Peter Lawford's actions on the night of Marilyn's death have also been scrutinized. He called Marilyn earlier that evening. He said she sounded strange. He said he was worried, but he did not go to her house. Instead, he called her lawyer and her housekeeper. Some have interpreted this as the behavior of someone who knew more than he was willing to say. Others see it as the behavior of someone who was genuinely concerned but did not want to be personally involved in what could become a scandal. Lawford's relationship with the Kennedy family deteriorated after Marilyn's death. His marriage to Patricia Kennedy ended in divorce in 1966. He was increasingly estranged from the family. In interviews later in life, he hinted that he had been made a scapegoat. He suggested that he had been pressured to stay silent about things he knew. But he never provided specifics. He never named names, and he never produced evidence that would substantiate his claims. The Kennedy family's response to allegations about relationships with Marilyn Monroe has been consistent. They have denied that any romantic involvement existed. They have characterized the rumors as false and invasive. They have pointed to the lack of concrete evidence. And they have suggested that the allegations are attempts to tarnish the legacy of two men who were assassinated and cannot defend themselves. That defense is not without merit. The burden of proof in such matters should rest with those making the allegations. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in this case, the evidence is not extraordinary. It is fragmentary, contradictory, and often based on testimony from individuals whose credibility is questionable. That does not mean the allegations are false. It means they cannot be proven true based on what is currently known. It is also worth considering the cultural and political context in which these allegations emerged. The 1960s were a time of significant social change. The Kennedy administration represented a new generation in power. The family was glamorous, wealthy, and influential. They were also Catholic, which made them a target for certain kinds of scrutiny. Marilyn Monroe, meanwhile, was a woman whose sexuality was central to her public image. She was seen as both desirable and vulnerable. The combination of these factors created a narrative that was irresistible to the media and the public. Rumors about affairs between powerful men and famous women were not unique to Marilyn and the Kennedys. Such rumors have existed throughout history. They serve multiple purposes. They humanize figures who might otherwise seem distant. They provide a sense of access to private lives. They allow for moral judgments about behavior that deviates from stated norms, and they offer explanations for events that might otherwise seem random or meaningless. In Marilyn's case, the rumors also serve to simplify a complicated life. Marilyn Monroe was an intelligent, ambitious woman who struggled with mental health issues, substance dependence, and the pressures of fame. She had been married 3 times. She had miscarried multiple pregnancies. She had been institutionalized. She had fought with studios over contracts and roles. She had tried to transition from being a sex symbol to being taken seriously as an actress. Her life was full of complexity and contradiction. Reducing that life to a narrative about affairs with powerful men erases much of that complexity. It makes her story about the men in her life rather than about her own choices, struggles, and aspirations. It positions her as a victim or a pawn rather than as an individual with agency. And it overlooks the many other factors that contributed to her tragic end. That said, the question of whether Marilyn had relationships with the Kennedys is not irrelevant. If such relationships existed, they would have been significant. They would have involved a president and an attorney general, 2 of the most powerful men in the country. They would have created vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by political enemies or by foreign adversaries. They would have been, by any measure, a matter of public interest. But public interest does not justify unfounded speculation. It does not justify treating rumor as fact. And it does not justify drawing conclusions that are not supported by the evidence. The story of Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedys is, at its core, a story about the limits of what can be known. It is a story about how easily rumor becomes accepted as truth when the subjects are famous and the details are tantalizing. What remains are fragments, a performance at Madison Square Garden, a few photographs, testimony from individuals who are now dead, redacted FBI files, secondhand accounts of conversations that may or may not have occurred, and a series of questions that have no definitive answers. Did Marilyn Monroe have a romantic relationship with John F. Kennedy? Possibly. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Did she have a romantic relationship with Robert F. Kennedy? The evidence is even weaker. Most of it comes from sources whose reliability is questionable. Did those relationships, if they existed, play a role in her death? There is no proof that they did. The theory requires assumptions that cannot be verified. What is certain is that Marilyn knew the Kennedys. She moved in circles where they were present. She performed for the president. She was friendly with his brother-in-law, and in the months before her death, she was under significant personal and professional stress, whether that stress was connected to the Kennedys or whether it stemmed from other sources, her firing from a film, her reliance on medication, her struggles with depression, is impossible to say. The story has persisted because it fits a pattern that people recognize. Power and fame intersecting, secrets and scandals, tragic endings. It is a story that feels true even when it cannot be proven. And in the absence of proof, interpretation fills the void. More than 60 years have passed since Marilyn Monroe's death. The people who might have answered these questions definitively are gone. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. Peter Lawford died in 1984. Eunice Murray, Marilyn's housekeeper, died in 1994. The witnesses who could have confirmed or denied the allegations have taken their knowledge with them. What remains is a story that cannot be closed because it was never fully opened. The questions were asked too late. The evidence was not preserved. The testimonies conflict, and the truth, if it was ever accessible, has been buried beneath decades of speculation, interpretation, and myth. Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedys, a connection that may have been casual or may have been profound, a relationship that may have been brief or may have been ongoing, a set of circumstances that may have been innocent or may have been dangerous. The answers depend on what is believed rather than what is known, and belief in the end is shaped by assumptions about power, fame, and the choices people make when they think no one is watching. The story endures not because it has been proven, but because it has never been disproven. And in that space between proof and disproof, the imagination fills in the gaps. The result is not history, it is mythology. And mythology, once established, is nearly impossible to dismantle.